Hi, Pastor Jonathan. Good to see you. To address poverty and hunger's other root causes. So really more how to develop and implement policies and programs that make healthy food accessible and equitably accessible to all Arizonans. So that said, there are a few basics that might be helpful to put. Hi, Representative Cano, good to see you. Okay, I can breathe now. All of the panelists are here. That's exciting. So there are a few things that might help put this conversation into context if you're not overly familiar with the policy process. So in Arizona, we have 30 legislative districts that represent roughly 230,000 people each. Each district has one senator and 2 representatives, and elections are held every 2 years. So the annual legislative session in Arizona runs from January through the end of April or the end of May or sometimes June. It kind of depends on when the state's budget for the next fiscal year is finalized, and negotiations on that budget are underway right now at the Capitol. So for anyone who wants to know more about the policymaking process, we will have some training sessions coming up, so keep an eye out for those. I'll also put some resources in the chat that are really helpful on how a bill becomes a law, if you've forgotten your schoolhouse rock, and sort of how the budget gets built here in Arizona. So now I'm going to turn it over to our President and CEO, Angie Rogers, who you might remember from moments ago, who's going to introduce a brief video and our panelists.
So yeah, I think, thank you, Ashley, for helping to facilitate this conversation. And I'm excited that we have a very esteemed group of panelists with us today, all from Southern Arizona. So a big shout out to Tucson and the southern part of our state. I think sometimes we forget here in the great state of Maricopa County about our wonderful neighbors down in Tucson. And so thank you all for joining us here to hear about the work that they're doing, specifically about there, and more importantly, how they work together, all the way from an elected official down to the food bank and down to an agency partner. You are all working hopefully very well together, and we're excited to hear about how that is or is not working in your efforts to improve the lives of those struggling with hunger. So as Ashley mentioned, we have a very short video that I want to be able to show for a moment, just a recognition of the work that our food banks have done, certainly the work that agencies have done. We had hoped to have a food bank day at the Capitol, where we invite legislators to learn more about food banking. They don't always know or always hear from each of you. And certainly many of them have never even toured a food bank. So we're encouraging them to do that. I know Mr. Cano is not one of those folks. He has been out to food banks before, but we did have a video, a real quick video we just want to show you so that you can understand a little bit more about what food banks were doing during COVID. So Ashley, go ahead. Thank you so much. And again, thank you. I see Pastor Smith clapping there. Thank you. Yes, we're very excited that we were able to put that together quickly to be able to show much of the good work that many of our food banks do on a day-to-day basis, but certainly the demand looked very different during COVID. Next, I want to do a little bit of introductions to introduce our three panelists for today. First off, we have Representative Andres Cano from Legislative District 3. Representative Cano is one of our younger members of the state legislature. We're really excited to have him as a great partner in our fight against hunger. He was raised by a single mom and saw a path for advancement through Arizona's public schools. He's a first-generation college graduate, and in 2018 was elected to his term in the Arizona House of Representatives. He sits on House Ways and Means and Natural Resources, Energy, and Water. Water being an incredibly important discussion in our fight against hunger. Our second speaker is Mr. Ojeda. Robert, it's good to see you. A wonderful partner at Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona. He is the Chief Program Officer who has been there since 2010 and oversees all of their programmatic initiatives, as you can see listed on his bio there. He does an amazing job at making sure that Community Food Bank runs so wonderfully. And finally, Pastor Jonathan Smith. I have never had the opportunity to visit his church or be down there, but I am putting it at the top of my list for this year. He is an ordained minister from the Seventh-day Adventist Church and a certified trainer and marriage counselor. I am excited to hear about what he has to say about how advocacy has played an important role in the distribution of food at his church. So I will start off with a pretty easy question, I think, for Representative Cano. And first, thank you for joining us while at the same time monitoring the floor and voting. And thank you for supporting food banks, particularly last year. You sponsored legislation that would have provided some additional funding to food banks. And we really appreciate your support in that. Can you talk a little bit about why anti-hunger legislation and resource allocation is so important to you in general?
Well, thanks, Angie, and to Ashley, to Pastor Smith, and to Mr. Ojeda, and all of you watching. Happy Wednesday, and I hope that in this conversation today, you recognize that there are folks throughout the state and especially at our Capitol who are with you on policy, on the solutions that we need to address in order to provide working people and folks, who I think of very deeply because all of the issues that we've talked about, the video that we just watched, the opportunity to see us come together in the midst of an international pandemic. What I like to remind folks prior to the pandemic, Angie and friends, is that we saw the cliff coming, right? I had in Southern Arizona, the district that I represent and have since 2019, a county, Pima County, that had 30 evictions per day in Southern Arizona. The reality that, not fully funding our food banks at the state legislature is not really a matter of available political resources, in my opinion. It's all a matter of political will. The fact that we have a near $2 billion surplus, for me, I promise to be very, very polite in my response today, because I recognize that this is a diverse crowd with many varied vested interests, but I will continue to support all of your policy initiatives and really demand that instead of having us on a yearly basis, have you come to the state capitol to defend your good work, that our state budget provides ongoing funding that would ultimately help each and every single one of you in your own tasks to help provide one of the most human things that we can do, which is to ensure that hunger is addressed and that we're supporting the most vulnerable communities. So that's a long way of saying I see a lot of my own upbringing, being raised by a single mom in Section 8 housing, and now being able to represent 200,000 constituents who, when you look at the amount of need, Mr. Ojeda would be able to speak to this. Legislative District 3 needs a lot of hands on deck, because when we're talking about the marginalized communities, those are the folks I now represent, Angie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Representative Kano. I just have a quick maybe follow-up question for you. You are the chair of the Latino Caucus. Can you talk a little bit about the inequities that we see in policies and programs that leave certain vulnerable populations behind? And certainly COVID relief has exacerbated many of those conditions. Do you see this issue with food access and hunger as well, or is it something unique maybe to housing? I don't know if you wanted to chat a little bit about the uniqueness of certain incredibly diverse communities.
Well, I think more often than not, what the response is from some at our state capitol who hold the ability to influence these discussions really, frankly, look the other way. Yes, housing is an issue that we've got to continue to address, because I have folks in my district, perhaps some of you know folks like this, who are working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, and housing continues to go up. So when you suddenly are paying more than 50% of your take-home pay to be able to fund your studio or 1-bedroom apartment because that's all you can afford, of course you're going to choose between whether you are going to, I don't know, pay your car insurance this month, pay your be able to go to Safeway and be able to have access. And I think that's where all the work that you're doing to address this issue becomes critical. I mean, I wish that what we would be able to do at the state capitol is focus on the quality programming that I know all of your food banks are doing right now, from farm to table, gardening, providing that empowerment for families to do what our Native and Indigenous folks have done for generations, which is to be able to be, producers and their own best advocates. And I think for me, it's all part of it. And the Latino Caucus is paying very close attention to the continued disparities that, it's kind of like we told you so at the state capitol, right? Vaccination distribution is still inequitable in Arizona. You've got to have access to a computer. You've got to speak English. You've got to be able to have the tech skills to be able to access the vaccine if you're interested in having that administered to you and your loved ones. So I think our role is saying with a $2 billion surplus, with a near $2 billion surplus, with billions in federal support throughout the pandemic, the fact that my local jurisdictions, Pima County and the city of Tucson, have had to beg our state government to reimburse us for costs related to the pandemic, I think is an important call to action for our federal partners, but most importantly to Arizonans. All of you, I hope, recognize that you have the tremendous ability to create meaningful change because of the work you see every single day in your line of work. I'm influenced by stories, Angie. The more that you can use stories and explain the impacts of policy, I think the better off we'll be.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, I agree. I think all of us are influenced by stories and the heart work that many of us do on a day-to-day basis. So I appreciate you sharing that. I want to move my next question to Robert. As a leader at Community Food Bank, I know you and your team are deeply embedded in your community and making sure that you work with your community to address the issue of hunger and the challenges that they face in so many difficult environments. And you've made policy work a priority for many, many years. Why is that important to your mission? And maybe more personally, why is that important to you?
Thank you, Angie. It's good to share the stage with Jonathan and Andres. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Ashley, for organizing this. There was a lot of work we did before the pandemic to really shift our model and have a model that was really more about regular opportunities to learn what's happening in the communities we serve in Southern Arizona. And the things we learned over time that, for example, 75% of our program participants This was a couple of years ago. Had a family member that had either diabetes or heart disease or diet-related illnesses. And so we really appreciate all the work we've done at the state to have fresh produce, for example, be a priority for us. It really addresses this idea that in addition to bringing food, can we bring healthier food? I think there's been a policy component that's really enhanced that piece. The other thing we learned was that a lot of folks throughout our service area had experienced different forms of social isolation. Our seniors that are feel homebound, that don't have access to communities in rural areas feeling isolated as well. And one issue that was very relevant around that was this idea that people want to have a voice in the issues that impact their communities. So we learned that, and as a response to that, for a while now, we've had we do work that's more really participatory in partnership with the communities we serve, really directly addressing policies that impact their lives, but really more and more moving in a direction to really have them take the lead. And the other issue that for us was really, really important to really uncover deeply was the idea that lack of economic opportunities for folks was really a central issue that impacts, food insecurity. So I would say a precondition for food security, for getting out of this problem, as Bernard talked about, we believe we can end hunger. So for us, the idea is that we can end hunger if we address this issue of, economic justice, if you will. People are able to make choices and purchase healthy food, things wouldn't continue to stay pretty much similar, the same, which has been the case for basically 4 decades. If you look at national trends around food insecurity, it's been around 12 to 14%. That really tells us, we could do more. The other thing that I think we've learned, and this is more of a national thing with the pandemic, is that about half of the folks that get support throughout the country accessing food aid have one working adult in the household, which also tells you these are, these are working families. And so clearly there's an issue around lack of economic opportunities that we could and should support. And what we've learned, to piggyback on what Representative Cano said, is that, we've learned with this pandemic that people most economically vulnerable are low-wage workers, women, people of color, who have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. And we know that in partnership with our local government, with our state and others, we could have really a much broader impact, particularly if we focus around policy issues. So for us, community voice is important, community-driven policy is important, healthy food is important, and we all play a role in making sure that happens. But also this important issue of economic opportunities for folks. And so, for example, I really appreciate, the Friends of the Farm initiative, because I think what it's done is brought healthy food to our communities, but also supported small farmers who at one point we heard would qualify for SNAP themselves. And so that is really an example of working with policy that really helps our program participants, but also our, the local food economy.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think you gave me a nice segue to our next panelist, Pastor Jonathan, who is both a provider of food and of faith. So I know you're active both in direct service and in advocacy. And we have a lot of faith-based organizations in our network, many of them obviously at the conference today, that do a lot of great work to feed and to clothe our neighbors in need. But we find often that they kind of shy away from the advocacy space. Maybe they feel like that's not their role. It takes them out of their comfort zone. Can you talk a little bit about why your church does to feed their community directly, but also why advocacy is a part of your work?
A lot of that depends on the leader. because of the fact that I have a master's in public health from the George Washington University. I have the privilege of navigating two distinctly different disciplines, one of religion and faith, but another of public health. And my concentration was in health policy and health disparities. So my church has been very gracious in following my leadership as it relates to advocation in the community. At GW, we talked about the fact that policy drives practice. And so in order to impact that practice, you have to engage in advocacy. So it's not enough for us to feed people twice a week, as we normally do at my church as a partner with the community food bank. Not only are we feeding people, but we distribute to other organizations so that they can do it as well. But we have to target the root causes of food insecurity, because yeah, we can feed people until the cows come home. But when we are able to liberate them from the need of having to come to food banks, then we have accomplished our purpose and existence. And so we advocate in three different roots that we know need to be addressed. One of those is a living wage. And so 2 weeks ago, I met with our Mayor Romero here in Tucson, and we talked about putting together a pastor's roundtable to try to encourage and engage other pastors in the advocacy for addressing the root causes of food insecurity, not just feeding people, but liberating them from hunger permanently. And so I advocated for a living wage for Tucson. Now we have it for our Tucson employees, but we're encouraging her to get that as a ordinance for the entire city, which she's working toward. The second thing that we want to look at in advocacy is education. Like Representative Kano, I'm a first generation graduate in my immediate family, and the impact of that changes the very trajectory of the entire family tree. And we need to see more of our at-risk kids, more of our minority kids, our BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, pursuing education as a vehicle for getting out of food insecurity. But not only that, the last thing is in Tucson, we really need to address the issue of affordable housing, because this is the #1 cause of homelessness, which also drives food insecurity. And we have to tackle those root causes for food insecurity in our community. And so I'm very intentional about advocating for that. I'm grateful to have our president of the Agency Advisory Council for the Community Food Bank, Ben Moore. We work together advocating on how we can deal with the root causes of food insecurity. And I just need to give kudos to Ashley St. Thomas with her very informative presentations for us on a monthly basis to the Agency Advisory Council of the Community Food Bank to let us know the legislative workings and levers that we need to pull in order to advocate. And as a board member of the Community Food Bank, we are talking about, and Mr. Ojeda understands this, establishing a 501c4 so that we can really begin to advocate for issues that we need to address in order to deal with food insecurity. So I have the privilege of being a pastor, but at the same time, a public health advocate, and I'm able to wed those two together. They're not in opposition, but they actually go hand in hand. And so my church is on the front line of not only feeding, but also advocating for those that are food insecure.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pastor Smith. I think you alluded to a lot of things that the state legislature funds, whether that be housing or hunger relief or mental health issues, a variety of different things that are on the plates of the state legislature right now and in discussions. Mr. Cano, can you give us a sense of where those budget negotiations are and what your priorities areas are for making it into that budget?
Sure. And thank you, Pastor Smith. I saw your comment that you are a constituent and it's an honor to represent you, and thank you for your service. The legislature is on day 101 of us being in session. Yesterday was a very difficult day on the House floor as we voted on a controversial purging of voters from the permanent early voter list. And I just saw it incredibly disheartening, folks, to on our 100th day be discussing such needlessly partisan issue when what our focus ought to be 100 days in, how we are going to get this budget passed so that we can provide meaningful relief to Arizonans. Our number one priority in the Democratic caucus, I am a member of the Democratic caucus, if you haven't noticed by now, 31 Republicans, 29 Democrats in the state house. 10 years ago, my party had 10 less members. We were at 19. So we've made a lot of progress in those years to be able to say, through the midst of this pandemic, what we've got to focus on is economic relief. The fact that we have the lowest, second lowest unemployment rate in the nation. I'd like to ask my colleagues time and time again on the House floor, could you survive on $240 a week? Which totals a little less than $1,000 a month. You're lucky to have that pay for just your house and maybe 1 or 2 trips monthly to the grocery store. Since we're talking about food insecurity. So I think for me, it's always going to be, what are we doing to help our most vulnerable? Unemployment at the very top, because it's a direct way, I think, to support lifting up those who are still facing the very worst of the pandemic. We've not, been able to get past the point where I feel comfortable saying that my constituents are taken care of. Eviction relief and support, right? We're hearing it from the constables, especially in Southern Arizona, the increase in evictions, and then what happens past the CDC moratorium on evictions. And we're finding that not only do renters and homeowners need support, landlords absolutely still need to be a part of this, right? This is not about pitting any one industry against one another. And so we can go down the list. And to Pastor Smith's point, I mean, education is always the number one thing that we think is an equilibrium for folks. And we have the most underfunded schools in Arizona and have a 10-year trajectory of not directly supporting our schools. One of my key priorities has been supporting our community colleges. For 3 years in a row, I've introduced legislation that would restore funding to Maricopa and Pima community colleges, because those institutions receive $0 from your state taxpayer funds. And they have since 2015. If we want good jobs, if we want good economic development, good workforce training, good jobs so that folks can feed their families, pay their bills, have a little extra at the end, why wouldn't we invest in the programs that directly support their upward mobility? So a lot, Angie, there's no one clear answer in all of this. I will say I am very delighted that you are starting to think a little bit more creatively as a collective unit, how you can use your strength in the advocacy space. I imagine that the moment you start talking about C4s and political advocacy, there's going to be some pushback, maybe from funders, board members who are a little not certain about that direction. But folks, when we have to come begging to the state capitol for our colleagues to do what's right, I think that is inherently political, right? It's a political decision to ignore you and look the other way, in my opinion. So keep doing it, because I think that's exactly what we need you to do moving forward.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. And Casey just chatted. It's great that we're talking a lot about shortening the line. I think all 3 of our panelists have talked about the importance of addressing the root causes of hunger and not just the immediacy of emergency food relief. So, Robert, your organization has been doing that type of work, the shortening the line type of work, for a while now. Including support for local food systems. You mentioned Friends of the Farm, sourcing from farms that pay livable wages, the Tucson Fight for 15, I think that Pastor Smith talked about. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important to you and how it plays into your full programmatic world down at Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona?
Sure. So for me, this is a very personal issue. My parents had a farm in Peru. My grandparents were farmers, and they struggled every day, trying to make sure that they could keep their farms running. So it's a very personal thing. And as we think about the work we do and the very important work of getting food to our folks, do we think about the conditions of those who are making that food get to the table? What are the conditions of those farm workers who are working at these farms, or distribution workers, or food bankers? And so our organization is really approaching this as a human right, and these are the rights of people that are part of this system. And so as we move forward, we're going to continue to emphasize our partnerships with organizations and companies that also are thinking about the conditions of their workers. They're thinking about, what kind of environmental impact are we having? How is this work supporting the local food economy? It is possible to do hunger relief. It is possible to support immediate needs of our community while also supporting and thinking about the well-being of others. That's definitely a priority for us as an organization. It's taken us years to come to this place. And so that definitely is something we want to emphasize. The other thing that I think is really important, and I see there's something there around the collaboration partners, we've learned through the pandemic, there are hundreds and hundreds of amazing organizations, grassroots organizations that are doing amazing work. So food banking shouldn't be about food banks getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but really decentralizing our network so that those amazing community-based organizations, mutual aid groups, grassroots organizations also get financial support, the kinds of support, capacity building support, so they can do for themselves. We've heard from many of our partners, really, we don't really need you telling us what to do. We need you as a partner. And so as we move forward, we want to continue to grow these opportunities. We had, a great opportunity with the city of Tucson, for example, where we were able to leverage some of the pandemic funding to directly go to these communities for like deep investment, multi-year. As an organization, we have a grants program, for example, and we're doing multi-year funding of these organizations who are doing amazing work. They don't have to prove it to us, it is happening. And so I think really letting go of this relationship where we need to scrutinize what's happening. It's really about trust and a different kind of relationship. So that's super exciting for us. I would say as an organization, largely we're really shifting and really thinking about the interconnected rights of people who are doing this work, including the rights of women in the food system, the rights of the immigrant workers in the food system, the rights of BIPOC communities, the rights of our Native American communities as we do this work. And so that is definitely a priority. What will happen, I think, for us is we'll probably look very different as an organization, but there is an important role all of us play. Those of us who are in operations and logistics and transportation, those of us who are doing more of the policy and work, those who are building social enterprises. So I think all of things are really energizing engine for us at the food bank, knowing that it's kind of for us, a narrow way of looking at this issue if the only thing we look at is those who are getting the food, which is really important. But there are many more players along this food chain. So we're going to try to be really mindful about this work. And there are many opportunities, Angie, for work, like the Friends of the Farm, that could really play a role in enhancing this kind of work.
We agree, Robert, right? Put your money where your mouth is and invest in programs that we know work, that help support not just those struggling with food insecurity, but the small rural communities where folks are struggling either themselves or just trying to run a small business and keep their family fed too. So I think our keynote speaker did a really nice job of talking about the two F's of friends and foes, and making sure we have more friends in that column than we do foes. Can each of you, and maybe starting with Representative Cano, talk a little bit about how you've been able to work with friends to get your goals accomplished and achieving a hunger-free Arizona, and maybe where you've had to struggle with some foes? I'll let any one of you start, but if you want to talk a little bit about how you gained some friends.
Well, I'll jump in right here. One of the ways that we gain friends here in Tucson in my church is that we are the voice for the voiceless. And they see our advocacy. We do a number of things at our church that is designed for the community. So we have done mental health first aid training at our facility in collaboration with La Frontera, so that we're training our membership to be able to provide mental health first aid. Now, you might say, well, what does that have to do with food insecurity? Well, what it is, it allows us to be a place where the community can come in and get these vital skills, and they begin to recognize that we are a place where that happens. So one of the foes, if you will, that I worked with, I'm on the Attorney General's Office of African American Advisory Council. And so I work with Fred Taylor, who's a special assistant to our Attorney General. And some of his policies, as Mr. Cano has already addressed, are not what I call friendly. However, I have had Fred Taylor to come at my church, and we host opioid training, opioid addiction training. We learn to administer Narcan in the event that someone overdoses on an opioid. Again, you may say, well, what does that have to do with food insecurity? It is establishing these networks and these connections with friends and foes, and we can cooperate where we agree, and where we can't, we have to agree to disagree. But we begin to formulate these relationships that can be synergistic, they can be mutually beneficial and symbiotic, and then the community knows that this is a place where that happens. And so that's what we try to do, to establish various partners. And this begins to develop into a coalition. So then not only are we doing this as a church, but we can partner with other churches. And then when it comes time for our united voice to be heard, that voice is a lot louder than Pastor Smith's voice, or even Representative Cano's voice, because he needs voices behind him that he represents. And so it builds up to this crescendo where we start getting the attention of those that we need to partner with us.
I love it. I love the passion behind your voice. You can tell why you are a pastor for sure. You're going to get us excited here about making sure we gather more friends and really confront those that talk about, maybe I don't see why housing is an issue related to hunger. I don't see why mental health is an issue related to hunger. It's all interrelated. It's all connected. And I'm excited to hear that you're recognizing that and addressing that at your community level. But Robert, Representative Cano, do you want to speak at all about how you've gathered friends?
I can share briefly to piggyback on what Pastor Smith said. I really believe that if we have a deeper understanding of what poverty looks like, those who are experiencing poverty, I think we can all really support this kind of work. I will tell you, when I was, very briefly, when I was 23, I came back from working in Latin America, and I thought, I want to do work helping people. So I went to Phoenix, this is years ago, to a training around developing community leaders. And 20 minutes into the training, the facilitator asked me to stand up and said, "Why are you here, Mr. Ojeda?" I said, "I want to help people." He walked around the room and said, "Raise your hand if you need Mr. Ojeda's help." And nobody raised their hands. And then he turned around and he said, "Who do you think you are? We don't need your help." And so I think that is really an important lesson, because the lesson is those communities we work with are very capable of identifying solutions, finding opportunities, and there's tremendous talent there. I think our role as an organization is to facilitate some of these things. I think when we understand that that really ought to be the nature of our partnerships with the communities we serve, then who's going to say no to, community-driven solutions? Who do we believe? If I tell myself I work for Michael McDonald, my CEO, rather than I work for the community I serve, then we're in trouble. Yes, Michael and I are partners, but I do work for those communities. And so I think it's the more we can engage with all folks around sort of that conversation, we're going to come up with real solutions to these issues that we face. And so to me, it's really about continuing to engage around those kinds of conversations. I think we all can support this kind of work.
Thanks, Robert and Angie, Pastor Smith. So I uploaded 2 links that I think are going to be super helpful to all of you in your individual quest to be able to highlight in the injustices in our state, because we have many. And it, being now a lawmaker for 3 years, my second term, there's still this big question mark as to what the hell we do at the state capitol. And I think folks who are in the know understand it, but ultimately folks who are working, paying attention to their loved ones, their small communities, it's a big mystery. We've got to understand the budget process, and I think the more that we've been able to inform Arizonans about their taxpayer dollars going to fund all of these core issues. I mean, I think one of the things that I always have ingrained in my head is that budgets, as you know, are a reflection of your values. It shows you where you want to go. The fact that our number 3 category statewide in terms of the overall $12 billion budget is the Department of Corrections. We spend more money sending people to prison in Arizona than we do on our 3 state universities combined. I don't know if you know that. Perhaps you do. The links that I just sent your way have some information that will show you specifically the unfunded priorities that we need to continue to uplift. And I think that's why we're continuing to ask you to be a part of this mobilization, because as you know, meaningful change starts, in my opinion, with knowing the numbers, knowing the figures, but ultimately, there's always going to be somebody saying, well, you're wrong. I don't think data is wrong. I don't think facts are wrong. And when you become more able to stand up for your communities, because that's what you see, think about how we can be here for you to help you continue to learn throughout this, because it's not easy.
Thank you. And thank you for the chats. I think Ashley threw some links in there as well for those of you that are trying to figure out, who we need to be talking to, who we need to gather as our friends, and who we need to encourage to come out of the faux category and really work with us, work with our communities to address hunger, to make meaningful change. I want to open it up because I think we only have about 15 minutes, maybe shortly less than that, to open it up to folks who have joined us here today. I think I saw about almost 40 people in our chat room. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, I'll open it up to anyone who wants to ask that either directly in the chat, or if you want to just raise your hand. I'm sure Ashley will do her best to try and find you and moderate that discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Angie, and thank you so much to the panel. I think that was fantastic. I want to give a very special thanks to Pastor Jonathan, who jumped in at the last minute, and it's just really good to see you and hear you. So I know we had some folks who had questions in advance that reached out to me. So I think I see Liz Taylor here, and I don't know if you're able to unmute or want to ask a question. If not, you can feel free to throw it in the chat and I can kind of read it for you. And Pastor Ben is also here. And I guess I'll start with a question that came in. And Mallory is also here. So she had a question for us about some of the things that her organization was able to do during the pandemic and the potential for expanding on those. So Mallory, I don't know if you're comfortable unmuting yourself and asking that, but that would be great.
Yeah, hi you guys, I'm here. So hi everyone, I'm a manager at Native Health. I work with our food pantry programs for Central Phoenix and Mesa. We recently got a grant funding to deliver food to Native American elders at home, just because we had a lot of elders reaching